2023 has seen many South Africans battle with an unprecedented cost of living crisis. Skyrocketing food and housing costs, coupled with a relentless energy crisis, has pushed millions to the brink of financial survival. To take a look at the prospects for next year, I'm joined by Mudiwa Gavaza, Economist at Business Day and the Financial Mail. We appreciate your time on this, the final day of 2023. Can you explain to us in simple terms the key economic challenges South Africans faced in the last year, particularly in relation to the cost of living crisis, load shedding and inflation?
Good evening, Hugo. On this last day of 2023, it has been, quite a tumultuous year, in the economy. And, what's most interesting about where we are right now economically is the fact that the two biggest issues that are affecting South Africans, that is rising living costs, otherwise known as inflation, as well as rising borrowing costs, otherwise known as interest rates, is a story that we are seeing happening across the board. This is one of the few times, in our modern history where we can see the same challenges that are in South Africa happening in the UK, happening in the United States, and happening in neighboring countries. Everyone is suffering from, that inflation and that interest rates. And what it has done for the South African economy is that it has resulted in a lot of slowing business activity, but most of all, it has seen consumers and their pockets having to be burdened by making very hard decisions. In economics, we often talk about opportunity cost, which is basically, with the scarce resources that you have at your disposal, what do you do with them? And there are very hard decisions that South Africans have had to make, in 2023, in the face of rising prices. Where do I actually put the little money that I have? So we've seen a lot of discretionary spending coming down and a lot more being focused on what is called essential spending. That's just your basics, having a roof over your head, making sure that there's food on the table, kids are going to school, rent is paid, but also at the same time meaning that a lot of what would be considered luxuries have unfortunately, been done away with, and it's even, crept up into the food that people eat. And I think one of the more interesting developments, I remember earlier this year, chatting with people from the, meat industry, talking about the fact that South Africans have even found themselves in situations, where beef is now being substituted by pork and chicken because, those are, considered to be cheaper meats, right? So even the food that people are eating on a daily basis is being affected by all of these, different challenges that are currently facing South Africans.
Well, Mudiwa, you've given comparison to what's happening globally, and that South Africans are not alone in this crisis, if you will. So let's talk about how consumers in other parts of the world, how national banks and governments are reacting to the same challenges that we are facing here in South Africa.
It has been an interesting one to watch. South Africa is typically known as being a small and open economy, and one that is quite susceptible to what's going on in the rest of the global economy. So, if a country like the United States sneezes, we often catch a cold or at least something in this part of the world. And our own central bank, that is the South African Reserve Bank, takes lead, often from what's going on in the United States and the Federal Reserve Bank and what they do. They might not, say it explicitly, but we see this across, central banks. So in the same way that we've been seeing interest rates being hiked in South Africa, we've seen similar action happening, in other parts of the world. And in the same way that we are starting to see a bit of a cooling off in terms of inflation in other parts of the world, we're also seeing that, coming through in South Africa as well. The other thing which is quite similar is the fact that a lot of people had expected that that 2023 would be the year where we would start to see interest rates really either, staying consistent, that would be known as a plateau, or at least starting to come down in some way. but we actually didn't see, much of that happening, especially a slowdown in interest rates, because the rate at which prices have been going up was much faster than people had anticipated, and that's something that's being felt, in many parts of the world. South Africa, has had a cumulative, if I remember correctly, 475 basis point, rate hike, since we began this hiking cycle more than a year and a half ago. And that basically means that interest rates have gone up by 4.75%, since we began this hiking cycle. And, depending on the type of debt or credit you have, in certain markets, it means you might even be paying up to 40 or 50% more in terms of servicing some of the costs that are out there. And that's something that we're seeing around the world.
Now, what a lot of countries don't have is what we have, which is load shedding, and this has significantly impacted the food value chain. How does load shedding affect the prices of essential goods, and why is it a critical factor in the cost of living crisis?
Well, it has been, quite a terrible thing that has happened, over the last, I'm going to call it 2 years. Load shedding has been with South Africa for, more than a decade now. But, in this crippling form that we've been seeing, the last 2 years have actually been, quite severe. I think I saw a stat the other day that said that we had, about 280 days of load shedding through 2023, which is a lot. A vast majority of the year was spent on that. And the way that that feeds into food prices is that it's an input cost, right? When you think about, let's say we were using the example of meat earlier on. So if you're a chicken farmer, for example, you are thinking about, the price of, getting eggs, the price of getting either chicks into your farm, or, hatching your own eggs. There's a cost associated with that. There's the cost of feed. There's the cost of, vaccines and medicines to make sure that you breed, healthy chickens. There's the cost of, the labor that goes into that entire process. There's the cost of electricity, to keep some of these farm runs, going. And then, once the chickens have been killed, there's costs that are associated to processing the meat and then transporting the meat, to the customer. But where load shedding then comes in is that it's coming in firstly as an extra input cost. That is there because you need to keep the lights on in your operation. And if there's no power certainty that's coming in from Eskom, then, a lot of farmers and other businesses around South Africa have had to take on that extra cost for themselves in the form of diesel generators, in the cost of, solar installations that we've seen becoming quite a norm. For example, places like Johannesburg, if you're running diesel generators, we are seeing huge costs coming in, on the side of, because you have to keep the diesel going. I think in the telecom sector, we know that the likes of MTN have said that they are spending, upwards of 400,000 liters of fuel per year to keep their sites going. And I think Vodacom is double that. So you can imagine what that looks like in the farming sector, and how then those costs then get passed on to the consumer. So when you see the price of chicken, the price of bread, all of these different basic foods that we have rising, you have to take some of that into consideration. Some farmers, some producers, have decided to absorb some of the cost, but you honestly cannot expect that to be a norm into the long run.
Well, Mudiwa, that's a pretty bleak analysis of 2023 for all intents and purposes. So let's look at 2024, which hits us tomorrow. Can we expect to see some light to the end of that tunnel, particularly with elections coming up during the year?
Well, it's going to be quite an interesting year that's upcoming. In light of the elections, what people will be waiting to see is how much headroom the ANC government is going to have. On the other side of the equation, people will be waiting to see how much ground the opposition parties would have been able to make. And that's going to lead into, what type of governing structures are we going to be having in our various municipalities, provinces, and the like, and especially where there isn't clear majorities, because I think that's one of the biggest fears that people are having is how do you then govern? Because in previous years, coalitions haven't worked out, to be the best. Perhaps we might see a situation where, certain parties do well in certain provinces, as opposed to the coalition governments, just so that you have that one party or one group that can be held into account. And that feeds a lot into business sentiment. From an economics point of view, macro, we've been talking about inflation and interest rates throughout today. Both of those things are expected to come down or at least plateau in 2024. That was the expectation at the start of 2023, but many people have started seeing some of the signs. Stats SA did, express the fact that inflation did slow down between October and November, a little bit, from 5.9% to 5.5%. So those are signs. In the US, we've seen that inflation has been almost cut by half from where we were, a year ago. So all those signs are pointing to a better inflation outlook for 2023, and hopefully that then means that we will find ourselves with lower interest rates. The expectation is that we're going to see that coming through in the second half of 2024.
And finally, before we let you go, Mudiwa, if you were to give us 2 pointers for those that are looking to a better managed financial landscape for 2024, what would those words of advice be?
I think the time-old advice is, budgets are more important than ever, especially in these times of crisis. You really need to have a good, solid, financial plan that's there. And then the other one is the fact that, as things change, because right now we are in a negative, sort of trend that we're in. As things, change and could become a bit more positive, it's always good for people to go out, talk to your banks, talk to your financial planners to see, because South Africa has the dubious reputation for being one of the most indebted nations in the world, which means a good number of South Africans have some type of a debt product, credit card debt, car loans, mortgages, that type of thing. And as interest rates begin, hopefully to come down, the advice is, go talk to your bankers and see if some of those rates, some of those repayment amounts can be adjusted. If things turn, in the opposite way, negatively, see if some type of negotiations can be done so that you can have either payment holidays or just to find a better way to manage your finances in 2024.
Mudiwa Gavaza, economist at the Business Day and the Financial Mail. Appreciate your time this evening on Newzroom Afrika.